Hello, everyone. All right. I am Robert Strand. I have the privilege to be the Executive Director of the Center for Responsible Business. And on behalf of Dean Harrison, who unfortunately could not be with us here today, but sends her warm regards and her gratitude, and the Center for Responsible Business, I'm thrilled to welcome you all to this very special joint Deans and Peterson Speaker Series. Just curious here. Students, show of hands. All right. Oh, we're in store for a good one. Here at the University of California, Berkeley and the Haas School of Business, promoting the ethical responsibilities of business are deep in our roots. In the early 1900s, a young student by the name of Walter A. Haas Sr. formed his views on social welfare and public affairs here at the University of California, Berkeley. Haas Sr., a Bachelor of Science who graduated in 1910, after whom this institution, the Haas School of Business, is now named, said later as the CEO of Levi Strauss and Company that the company owes responsibility to the communities in which it does business. Fast forward 100 years, and that legacy of social mindedness and business lives on in the Berkeley Haas culture and in our defining leadership principles. We're joined here today by two esteemed members of the academic community who have continued to question and challenge ideas of what it means to be a responsible company and the ethical implications of business. We're grateful to have Professor David Vogel, the Solomon Lee Distinguished Professor Emeritus of Business Ethics here at the Haas School of Business. He's written extensively on both environmental management and corporate responsibility, including California Greening, how the Golden State became an environmental leader, and the market for virtue, the potential and limits of corporate social responsibility, which happen to be hugely influential in my PhD and beyond, and I'm one of many people. Professor Vogel also serves as editor of the academic journal, the California Management Review. And we extend a very warm Berkeley welcome to Professor James O'Toole, who hails from the University of Southern California's Marshall School of Business, where he is Professor Emeritus and founding director of the Neely Center for Ethical Leadership. Professor O'Toole began his academic career at the USC Business School, where he's held the University Associate's Chair of Management, served as executive director of the Leadership Institute, and editor of the New Management magazine. Professor O'Toole's research and writings have been in the areas of leadership, ethics, corporate culture, including the focus of today's conversation, the Enlightened Capitalists, cautionary tales of business pioneers who tried to do well by doing good. You've both done so much, we may never get to the talk. So let's turn to today's topic, Enlightened Capitalism. Our speakers will spend the first part of today's discussion reflecting on stories of Enlightened Capitalism's journey over the last century, including individuals like Haas Sr. and with companies like Levi Strauss. But perhaps, even more importantly, they'll look forward the role of Enlightened Capitalism can play in today's dynamic world and explore what the future might hold for those of us who strive to do well by doing good. I will also invite some of our fine University of California, Berkeley students up here to pose some questions that they're grappling with as they consider the future of responsible business. And finally, we aim to have an audience question or two before the end of our time together. With that, I'm thrilled to turn it over to Professor David Vogel and Professor James O'Toole. Please, join me.
So, Jim, the Business Roundtable has recently issued a statement which has gotten enormous attention, heralding a new dawn of capitalism, and the argument is that nowadays companies need to care not only about their shareholders, but also about their broader social impacts. And in some ways, your history, the history of Enlightened Capitalism, shows that this is actually not a novel idea, that throughout the history of capitalism, there have been managers and owners who've really tried to integrate social and financial objectives within the same company. So I think your historical study is fascinating because it tells us, gives us a sense of how these things worked out over time. How have other efforts to promote enlightened capitalism, promote the Roundtable's principles, what's happened?
David, that statement by the Roundtable was, in many ways, absolutely surprising and shocking, because at the heart of what they said was that moving forward, that they were going to turn their backs on what had been one of the major tenets of publicly traded corporations, publicly traded shares, and that is the notion of shareholder primacy. And that is that the first responsibility of a corporate executive is to provide the profits to who are the owners of the company. And they said, no, from now on, what we're going to do is we're going to take into account equally, and sometimes we're going to put ahead of the shareholders, the community, the environment, the workers, and customers. And that this, the 1,700 or 1,800 people signed this document was really, really remarkable. But it wasn't unprecedented. And the history of enlightened capitalism, of doing exactly what those contemporary executives were talking about, first started in 1815 in Scotland, when a young manager got together a whole group of investors in Manchester, England. At that time, Manchester was the Silicon Valley of the Industrial Revolution. And there were a lot of VCs there, and there were a lot of people who had a lot of money, wanted to invest. He put together a whole group of those people. He bought what was the largest mill, cotton mill in Scotland at the time. It was a terrible place. It was like William Blake's dark satanic mills. There were 5-year-old kids working 12 hours a day, standing the whole time in these factories that were freezing in the winter and boiling in the summer, and they were breathing this cotton fluff. And it was an incredible, awful place. In the community in which they lived had open sewers, and they were all crammed together in very, very small, terrible places to live. And Robert Owen, that manager, said, I think we can change things. He'd been influenced by Thomas Jefferson, and particularly Jefferson's notion of the pursuit of happiness, which Owen understood correctly meant the opportunity for each individual to make of him and herself all that they are capable of being. And Owen said nobody is able to make of themselves, to develop themselves as a human being in these circumstances. But they're spending all their time at work. If people are going to have a chance to pursue happiness, it's going to have to be at work. So I'm going to restructure the entire organization, everything about it, to turn it into a crucible for human development. He took the kids out of the factory and put them in a marvelous school. He invented progressive education, taught the kids music and art, not just reading and writing. He provided night schools for their parents. He made sure that every family had a 2-story house with several bedrooms, and that the entire community was cleaned up, and that the factory became a safe and healthy place to work. He provided health insurance for his people, even pensions. This is all in between 1815 and the early 1820s. It's hard to imagine that happening at that time. It was particularly hard for his investors to understand, because they said, this company's making a good profit. Indeed, it was. It was probably the most profitable business, big business in all of Great Britain at the time. He said, but we could have more of those profits if you quit spoiling the workers. You're mollycoddling them, they said. None of your competitors are doing it. You don't have to do this for competitive reasons. So they said, stop doing all that and give us the money and let us decide what we should do with our money. After all, you work for us. He fought them and he fought them and he fought them, but ultimately they won. They pushed Robert Owen out of the company, and within a couple of years, they brought back all the old ways, and the productivity and the profitability of the plant went back to where it was before Robert Owen. It was a very, very sad story, and what is so sad about that story is that in one way or another, in these couple dozen cases that I look at, it's been repeated in Britain and the United States over the last 200 years.
So we're now living in a world not of shareholder capitalism. And so how has the rise and emergence of shareholder capitalism, how has it affected the ability of a professional manager or a professional owner to act responsibly over time? What have we learned?
Well, I think if we look at the record, it's actually made it a lot harder. I'll give you another example, a little briefer example this time. J.C. Penney. J.C. Penney, some of you have been in Penney's department store. There's still a few of them around. If you were as old as David and me, you would remember a time in which there were Penney stores everywhere. And Penney stores were known for their incredible ethics and customer service. James Cash Penney founded what he called the Golden Rule stores, which is what they were called originally. And he was dedicated to providing high quality products at the lowest possible price to working class people in America. And he established what he called the Penny Principles, which talked about the social responsibilities that all of his people had to their communities, to their employees, and particularly to their customers. And Penny ran the company that way. It was a model company. It was one of the most respected companies in America for years. But gradually he lost control as the company went from being privately held by Penny and his managers. At one point he had 1,000 managers, 1,500 managers who with him owned the company. But as they retired, they started selling their shares on the open market. And by the time Penny was in his 60s, he'd lost control of the company. It was now the publicly traded shares, and that changed the entire thinking of the managers. Poor old James Cash Penney stayed on to the board until he was 90 years old. And for the last 15 or 20 years of that, every time a vote came up on the board, it was 9-1, 9-1. He was trying to hold on to the ethics and to what happened, but the rest of them were responding to the dictates of Wall Street. And all that good stuff that Penny did disappeared, and along with it, the success of the company.
So your book also, of course, talks that we have 24 stories, most of which are sort of unhappy ending stories. So you start out by companies that are both successful, financially successful, and socially responsible, and over time, they become more financially successful, many of them, but less socially responsible. But on the other hand, every decade there seems, your book is a history, so every decade there seems to be another wave, another generation, another movement of managers and owners to try to expound the principles of enlightened capitalism. How do you explain the resilience of interest in corporate social responsibility over 2 centuries, in spite of the fact that so many times it's these pressures from financial markets and from customers wind up undermining good, virtuous managers?
It's very hard to know the motivations of people. And I was really interested in that question, David. And I tried in my research to learn why it was that these people would make their lives a lot harder and also their careers a lot riskier by trying not only to have profitable businesses, but also to have ones that were ethical and in every way socially responsible. There were always just a few of them. But as you write, almost every generation there have been some. But why? And when I looked into it, I found that there were certain things that these people had in common. A great number of them had religious motivations. James Cash Penney was the son of an itinerant Baptist minister who believed basically in the Golden Rule, and he led his life that way. And he said that the only times that he ever went wrong in his life was when he set aside the Golden Rule in the pursuit of profit. And he said he did that many times, and every time he did it, he said he got into trouble. Bob Haas, who is the last of the Haas family to run Levi Strauss. I asked Bob recently, I said, just before I wrote the book, I said, what was the motivation in your family? And I said, is it the Jewish religion? And he said, well, we were kind of secular Jews. And he said, and we never talked about religion per se in our family. And I said, well, don't you think there's something in the Jewish tradition that was there that influenced you? And he said, absolutely yes. He said, but it wasn't the kind of thing that we talked about or that we ever went to temple or anything. But he says, I think there was something about Jewish culture, that led us in that direction. And there was a very large number of Protestants and Jewish people in the book, and one or two Catholics as well, who actually pointed to religion as being a factor. But at the same time, there were atheists, and at the same time, there were people who like Robert Owen, who was not a believer, who was a child of the Enlightenment, who were humanists. And Thornton Bradshaw, the president of Atlantic Richfield, who you wrote a book with, was a classic example of this. All the good things. He actually did this good stuff at an oil company. Can you imagine that? And it was all because of his influence of reading about the Enlightenment and reading Locke and Rousseau and Jefferson, and he was very, very much a humanist in that regard, and that's how he explained, what he was doing. So the motivations are varied, and sometimes I just think that it is a pivotal event in somebody's life that will change them. There's a company that was called Control Data Corporation that no longer exists, but it was the company that beat IBM in terms of creating the first really great mainframe computer. They were the real pioneers in the computing industry right after World War II. And they concentrated almost solely on making computers. And then there were the riots that occurred in the 1980s in Minneapolis. And the CEO of the company was so taken by the effect of the riots that he changed the direction of the entire company, trying to turn everything the company did into solving society's problems. And so the motivation there was one of trying somehow to make corporations the vehicle by which the most pressing social questions facing the world are addressed, and there are several people today, who talk that way as well. So, no one reason, I don't think.
So we have a history of these efforts, many of which don't work out, but yet the resilience of the principles of enlightened capitalism or of corporate social responsibility remain very viable. So when I wrote The Market for Virtue, I was writing about 15 years ago, I was noting a big resurgence of interest in corporate responsibility, and we now, of course, are seeing another one as well. So there's a lot of things going on, which you talk about in the book, about new initiatives, new forms of governance, new efforts to, again, push the envelope and figure out ways of making enlightened capitalism sustainable. So what's your sense of this current move in which we're now in, this current resurgence of this brave new world?
Well, when we first met, David, in the 70s, we also went through a moment like this, in which there was a tremendous amount of interest at business schools, in corporations. And it was in the 80s, particularly in the early 80s, and by the early 90s, during the Clinton boom years, suddenly all that stuff disappeared. At USC, we had 5 courses that we offered having to do with business and society, social responsibility, business and government, ethics, and the like. During those boom years, they were all gone, and we switched to shareholder value. That became the key issue. It all just disappeared, and it disappeared. In the Harvard Business Review used to talk about this stuff. They forgot about it. Fortune talked about it. They forgot about it. So, yeah, but is it different today? I guess, is the question. Well, I think, your book, one of the things that could make a real difference is if are consumers demanding it, or it's just the public in general demanding this of corporations. You pointed out that some consumers are, but not a lot of them. All right, there is a limited market. And in terms of public demand for these things, When you ask people, do you trust corporate executives? It's, I mean, they're almost rating as bad as the Congress. It's very, very low. But when you ask people, what are the 10 things that you think really have to, 10 most important issues facing America today? Believe me, this issue doesn't make it, right? And so they do seem to care about the environment, which is an exception. And corporations seem to be more responsive in that area because that's where they're getting some pressure. And also in the issue, to some extent, of executive salaries, where it doesn't look good, and so there's some pressure in that. But in terms of the broader kinds of issues that people like the Haas family looked at, there is very, very little public pressure.
Do you think the private model of a privately held company is a viable alternative to the pressures, shareholder pressures?
I mean, the good news is that I look at about 50 companies in the book and about 25 of them in depth. And there are about 4 companies that are the exception to the rule. These are 4 relatively large companies. Let me take to start with. There are lots of small, publicly held corporations in which the owners are ethical, they take care of their employees, they care about their products, family-owned small business, lots of them out there, okay? But we don't know anything about them, and they tend to be relatively small. But there were a couple of large ones that were out there. What did they have in common? They had in common several things. A very, very large share of employee ownership. And companies like the Lincoln Electric Company, SRC, Holdings, companies that for a long time, employees and managers and the founding family owned the majority of shares in the company. And those companies were able to sustain, through changes in leadership, their enlightened practices. But once that erodes, they tend to lose it too. Worker cooperatives, worker-owned companies, and now this growing movement called B corporations. It comes in 2 forms. One of them is B-certified companies. I'm sure you're studying about it at the Haas School. There are now something like 3,000 or 4,000 of them, almost all of them relatively small. But now they're all over the world, in which basically they get certified as on about 6 different criteria for having enlightened practices. And keeping this certification going becomes very, very much a part of the culture of these organizations. And so they're relatively new. We don't know if they're going to last 2 or 3 generations, but they are now one of the most promising things that's happening. But perhaps the most promising thing are benefit corporation charters, which are state charters that set aside the doctrine of stakeholder primacy. That is, a company can go and get a charter in the state of California, for example, in which the managers, even if there are shares and there are investors in the company, that the managers and the board are free to make decisions that benefit society and their various stakeholders, even at the expense of shareholders. And they legally do that, and they cannot be sued. But interestingly, they can be sued for failing to do those good things. And that is actually, there are about 4,000 companies in the US. The most famous one very active here is Patagonia, that have benefit charters. And when Yvon Chouinard was asked, why are you going in this direction? He said, why are you doing this? And he said the biggest threat, he understood this for years, that the biggest threat to his company was if he ever got acquired, or if there was a succession in which there was the option of selling the company or moving away from its commitment to the broader good. And so what he did, he's done everything that he possibly can to lock in all of the enlightened practices for future generations. But it takes a tremendous amount of work to do that, and tremendous willpower, and also, in his case, turning down a couple of $2 billion in cash for people who wanted to buy the company.
So being privately held does seem to be one strategy. which can enable this to become viable, to remain viable.
Yeah, and also another one too, that is available in Europe, but not in the United States. And that is ownership of corporations by foundations. The Bertelsmann, IKEA, Bertelsmann, Carlsberg, Heineken, many of the biggest companies in Europe today do not have to worry about hostile takeovers because the majority of their shares, even though they sell shares in the public, the majority are held by foundations that are sworn to make a commitment to the long-term sustainability of their enlightened practices. That option is not available to American corporations as of about 1973, unfortunately. But it is a way of really building sustainability into organizations. The sad story on this one is the Unilever story. Unilever, for the last 10 years, has been ranked as the most socially responsible large corporation in the world. They're operating in 180 countries and with 500 brands or something like that. And the CEO there wanted to commit the company to a long-term pattern in which they would be known as the most socially responsible company in terms of hiring of women, in terms of treating people well in the developing world, in terms of safe and healthy products. And he said it's going to take about...
And particularly on environment.
And on the environment. He said it would take about maybe 10 years to get there. But after about 10 years, he says, no, we're not there. We've got to keep going. It's very hard to do. Very, very hard to do. He was making money, but he wasn't making enough money. And so what he sought to do was to list the company in Amsterdam. That was to make it the company based in the European Union rather than in England, where the practices of the stock market and where shareholder capitalism rules are very similar to the US, in which they favor shareholders and in which they encourage hostile takeovers, or they make it relatively easy to have a hostile takeover. That is not the case in continental Europe. He tried to move the company out, the headquarters of the company, to save it. He was blocked by his investors from doing so. And right after he was blocked, the investors came in and they pushed him out of the company. So there is, whether it's Patagonia or whether it's Unilever or whether it's Whole Foods, what happens is companies are scrambling, trying to find legal ways to structure it, forms of ownership and structure, to allow themselves to plan in the long term to do these things and not be susceptible to investor pressures for short-term profits, or to sell the company to a company that doesn't share the values, as was happened at Whole Foods. They thought they were going to have to sell the company to Safeway. Mackey tried to save it, and unfortunately, his only recourse at the last minute was to sell it to Amazon, which was probably almost as bad an employer as Safeway.
So if we were to look at, if we were to reconvene 20 years from now, what do you think we would, how do you think we'd look back on these current initiatives? Would you have another chapter of would the next edition of your book 20 years from now tell another gloomy story?
Well, I would be 95 when I wrote it, so it would be rather, I can't imagine it.
In other words, the argument, the Financial Times said we're now with the Roundtable statement, with all the social impact investing, with the concerns about social responsibility. We're now entering a new era of responsible, enlightened corporate capitalism.
Well, David, you wrote a nice blog the other day in which you concluded, you said, I think we really can't count on those large publicly traded corporations. But what we should do is at least make sure that they obey the law. And that what we should expect of large corporations is to try, not to do harm. But to expect them to do good may be almost impossible given the fact that they have to meet the needs of their shareholders. But then there is all this other economy that is out there, this alternative economy, the social entrepreneurs, the B corporations, the co-ops,
social investment movement.
All that is out there. And there's going to be all the small companies that the young people in this room are going to start. Right? And they're going to have good companies because there are a lot of young students today who are getting MBAs in social entrepreneurship, for example, and are fascinated by the big corporation movement and deciding that they don't want to go to work for AT&T. What they want to do is they want to start their own business where they can live their values. And I think that the future really is with the young people who will do that, starting in these smaller companies. So what I want to say, each of you want to do good, start your own company and do good.
So my guess would be, so if we reconvene 20 years from now, we'd see some of these initiatives would wind up to be sustainable. Some would wind up to be disappointing. But we also then see new initiatives emerging. So I think ultimately the good news is that these efforts to address the challenges of combining profitability, shareholder value, financial viability with broad sustainability goals, that's an ongoing challenge. And although many efforts will not succeed, it's very important that we keep on trying to push the envelope.
Yeah, and I would say that the one good, really good thing about American capitalism is that it is not monolithic, right? And corporations, you look at corporations, they go their different ways for different reasons. There are different forms of ownership. I think that a healthy economy is one that really has a mix of form of ownerships and a mix so we can see what works, and it's a constant experiment. The disappointment among the business community with me is that too few people learn the lessons of the past. You know, it's like they reinvent this stuff. I remember being in Silicon Valley about 15, 20 years ago, and I went to the first conference on social responsibility they'd had down there for a very, very long time. And they thought that they had invented the concept, that they were the first ones. You know, and they were totally unaware of what had happened, even with Hewlett-Packard in their own community. Totally unaware of all the pioneering work that happened in San Francisco with Levi Strauss and Bank of America. Didn't know a damn thing about it. They were reinventing it. It doesn't have to be reinvented. There's a lot of stuff there, and that's what these stories tell us.
And David and Jim, I think we can take this opportunity here with respect to learning the lessons of enlightened capitalists. Perhaps we turn it over to our students to ask some questions. It sounds like a challenge to you all to learn these lessons and keep asking questions. We put students at the center of everything. At the Center for Responsible Business, we have 3 bright students. Michelle Sims, I'd like to invite you to come up first and pose a question to our esteemed guests here. So please, Michelle. Yes.
Hello, and thank you for this discussion. So my question kind of has to do with this idea of the resilience of interest in the principles of CSR. Fundamentally, it seems like we need an ideological shift away from the idea of limitless financial growth, kind of epitomized by quarterly returns, towards sustainable value creation that benefits society. Although this seems like a daunting task, how might we capitalize on the current movement around business sustainability and create structural changes through policy reform or other means that can help institutionalize what you refer to as enlightened capitalism?
Okay. I mean, I think that when I wrote The Market for Virtue, I had sort of a more skeptical view of the potential of a market for virtue. I do think the one area where there is enormous potential is on the environment. But that is to say, there really are a lot of opportunities for companies to act more responsibly vis-a-vis the environment in ways that are financially viable, that make business sense. So I think that that's a very encouraging development, and I think that all the companies which have pledged to reduce their carbon footprint, et cetera, a lot of very exciting things going on. I do think that in the long run, public policies that promote responsible business decisions on the environment are also very critical. And I think when you look at corporate responsibility, I think one of the most responsible thing companies can do is lobby for regulations that force all companies to be as responsible as them.
Yep. And I mean, one of the things, David and I wrote an article couple years back called 2.5 Cheers for Capitalism. And I insisted on the extra half cheer. He wanted to give him 2. We talked about how sensible regulation, kind of David's talking about, can benefit corporations and benefit society. And the key example of that was with catalytic converters. I taught it. I spent a lot of time at USC, and USC is in downtown Los Angeles. And I was an undergraduate there, starting in 1973. And it wasn't until a strange weather pattern in 1975 that I noticed that the San Gabriel Mountains almost come right into downtown Los Angeles, that the smog was so thick from where we were that we couldn't see these enormous 4,000-foot, 5,000-foot mountains just sitting right there. It was all caused by smog. Right? You can now, it's relatively clear down there now. It's because of the catalytic converter. How did the catalytic converter come about? No single company was willing to put in the catalytic converter because it would have given the other guys who didn't do it a competitive advantage. So when the EPA came along and they said, we'll make everybody do it, Ford and General Motors and Nissan, they didn't complain because everybody had to do it. So they didn't have to pay any price, and we all benefited. So that kind of legislation, I think, is very important. And finding ways to do that sort of thing, I think is a real challenge, a creative challenge.
Thank you, Michelle. Michelle is a Master's of Science candidate at UC Berkeley Energy and Resource Group, and we're proud to have Michelle as a CRB Student Advisory Board member. And the next individual that I'd like to invite is Dalton Guthrie. Dalton, please come up. Dalton is a full-time MBA candidate and co-president of the Berkeley Haas Net Impact Club. Dalton, please.
Hello, thank you for coming and sharing this really important discussion with us today. So we talked a little bit about some alternative ownership structures that have some promise. And we've also talked a lot about how for a public corporation, shareholder primacy is a very real thing today. Given that right now and for the foreseeable future, public corporations are a very significant portion of the economy, I want to focus a little bit on that investor perspective. So there's a movement within impact investing that we've talked about a little bit on focusing on environmental, social, and governance issues with the idea that a lot of these ethical movements and activities are actually aligned with the long-term value of the company. Do you think that this focus on ESG components can change the way that investors are pressuring companies to adopt and actually keep some of these beneficial activities?
I'll go first. I'm skeptical because I think the relative importance of ESG factors in terms of shareholder earnings remains relatively modest. And that's what concerns me. They can be important, but I don't know that they're going to be important enough. I'll give you an example. Okay, so on Monday, the Dow Jones moved to a record high because Apple reported spectacular earnings. On Tuesday, it dropped triple digits because Walmart reported depressed earnings. That was a really significant impact. None of that had anything to do with ESG performance. So I think there's a role to be played, but I think as long as ESG funds produce above rate of returns or comparable rate of returns, they'll remain viable. But if we have an economic downturn, a stock market slump, and those funds have a lower rate of return, then I think that movement will find it hard going forward.
Yeah, I agree entirely. That was so promising. You know, this ethical investing started in the 80s. And when they put in those first funds, I was investing in TIAA-CREF, and they were one of the first to introduce one of these funds. And when I looked into it, I said, how do you define, what's an ethical company? And it ended up that the portfolio didn't look a hell of a lot like just a random portfolio of Fortune 500 companies. And when you look at these ESG funds, you can see that one of the biggest problems they have is defining virtue. Now, some of them, what they call virtue is that they don't do alcohol, tobacco, or gambling.
And now coal.
Yeah, we'll go about this, but first, those three. Okay, well, is that what makes an ethical company? That happened to a lot of brewers and vineyard owners, who run marvelously socially responsible companies who are perfectly ethical. Okay, and you look at each of these funds, it's almost arbitrary. What they pick and what they don't pick. Talking about the coal, the largest sovereign fund is the Norwegian sovereign fund. And they got out of coal. So we're not going to do coal anymore. But all their money is based upon money that came from oil and gas to start with, right? And so these inconsistencies are there. Until they can come up with real definitions, it's not going to change behavior. The CEO of BlackRock and the CEO of Vanguard went to Davos last year, and they said, from now on, we're going to disinvest all the bad guys, and we're only going to invest in good guys. From now on, so help us God. 6 months later, they found out that those two companies were the largest shareholders in gun manufacturers in the U.S. And when it was pointed out to them, they didn't divest. The other issue is, as long as they make money, it's going to be okay. But if you're running a union pension fund, and you say to your retirees, I'm sorry, you're not going to get as much money this year because what we're doing is we're getting rid of these really profitable companies, because there were problems with pollution. The union leaders themselves vote against the interests of their own workers on these things because they got to keep the profits up, for their employees. Nobody invests for a purely social purpose, okay? Or if they do, it's a private investment. Somebody will put their money in your social entrepreneurial organization. But when you go to Wall Street, no matter what they say, they're there because they want to make money and they want to make as much of it as they can. And until that changes, until that mentality changes, and I don't think that will. I think it's part of human nature. I'm skeptical.
And I'm going to ask our final student, Nancy, if you'd kindly make your way up here. But I'm looking at the clock, and I think that we might actually have some time for a question or two. So get the wheels turning for a question here. And Nancy Reyes Mullins is a Masters of Development Practice candidate here at UC Berkeley. And we're also very proud because Nancy is also a CRB Student Advisory Board member. So please, Nancy.
Thank you both so much for being here. I have to say I read the book over the past 2 weeks and learned a lot because it's an issue that's been of
That's why you
interest
have
to
those
me.
double-digit sales.
And so I'm really hoping that my question answers the question of many students and potentially professors here. And that is enlightened capitalism something that can be taught in business schools, or is it ingrained much earlier into the DNA of the founder, which appears to largely be the case for those profiled in the book? And also, if it can be taught, how willing do you think that schools are to incorporate business ethics and social responsibility into the coursework?
The number of business schools now offering MBAs in social entrepreneurship is growing at a very, very fast rate. This is a true phenomenon, and I know at USC we've been doing this now for about 7 years, and we have about 40 new MBA students who would actually get degrees in MBAs in social entrepreneurship. They offer those kinds of MBAs at Oxford now and at dozens of other universities around the world. So that is happening, and I think it's a very positive thing. Can it be taught? I taught leadership and ethics for my entire career. If you ask me, can you really say that you actually made somebody into a great leader with what you taught, or into an ethical person? I would say I'm not sure that I did. I'm not sure. I wouldn't make that claim. But I do know one thing that was worth trying. All right, that if we as professors give up in terms of trying to create people to be responsible leaders, to be ethical leaders, we will have failed our responsibility as teachers and mentors to the next generation. So, despite everything that I've said, in my teaching, I still teach this to the class. I say, you got to do this. You got to try it. I encourage it. I want you all to go out and do it. All right? Just understand It's a lot harder than it looks. Trying to be good ain't that easy. They point out in the book. And trying to do good is hard too. But it is possible. And that you try to do it is the most important thing. And we try to teach people to do it. It gives me is the hope for capitalism, and it's a hope for this nation.
Opportunity for questions, please. We have microphones here, so please, if you kindly make your way to the microphone. And if you could start over here, if you kindly say who you are, where you're coming from.
I'm Alex. I'm a first-year MBA here at Haas. And I'm interested in impact can mean so many different things to so many people. And the Business Roundtable definition is highly vague. And do you think that there'll be a standardization on actual metrics of what being a good company means, or will it still be defined by different companies in different ways?
I started looking at good companies in 1973. And if you ask me to define these enlightened companies and what do they have in common, I'd say, well, they're good in a lot of different ways. Right? And there isn't just one way in which they are responsible. And a lot of the ways in which they're responsible are ways that are very, very hard to measure. It's hard to measure ethical behavior. For example, it's a hard thing to quantify. So I think that there are professors who actually spend all their time trying to come up with these kinds of measures. Believe it or not, in 1973, General Motors of all companies tried to quantify their social impact of their actions on society. They failed. We worked with ARCO, and they tried to do it, spent a lot of money. They even paid guys like us to come help them do it. They could never really do it. And it ended up that when they talked about what they did, it all came out sounding very vague and general, and in any attempt to really quantify it, failed. And they had people there who knew how to run numbers, right? So it's hard. It's really very hard.
Kindly say who you are too, please.
Hi, I'm also Alex. I'm also part of the MBA program. My question is that the story about the catalytic converter really resonated with me. But how do you think we can do that when we have an administration that believes in small government?
Yeah, no. I think that the likelihood of the current administration supporting such initiatives is obviously is zero. And I think that's very discouraging. I think what is more encouraging is the growth in state regulation, including in California, where catalytic converters actually began before they went to Washington. So I think that until we have a better administration in Washington, we're going to have to rely on local governments to pressure companies and create a space for them to be more responsible. Let me just say one thing on the catalytic converter. Using catalytic converter means that you cannot use leaded gasoline. So basically, leaded gasoline eventually disappeared. The reduction in the lead in the air over the last 30 years, actually now 50 years, is probably one of the most impressive public health accomplishments in American history. Okay, blood levels of people, particularly in inner cities, of lead content have dramatically down. People even argue that some of the decline in crime is due actually to lower blood levels, to lower lead levels in blood. So this is a big, regulation has really made a big difference, and it's tragic that the impact of public policies in these areas is going to, in the future, looks very modest and discouraging.
Yeah, we're going to have a little example of that, I think, in coming months here in California, and really, I think this actually speaks to the question that all three of the students raised, and that is the future of PG&E. People are talking now about turning PG&E into a consumer cooperative, which makes, I personally think, a hell of a lot of sense. Okay, how that is structured, how they get from point A to point B. Okay, that's all your finance professors will keep very busy, and they'll get good fat contracts for consulting for doing that. But nonetheless, if we move in that direction, that's another example of a local initiative that could have benefits not only in terms of reducing reducing fires, but also in lowering the cost of energy to all of us, and perhaps even having some positive impact on the environment as well, if it's done right. So when you look to these kinds of experiments, you look to these sorts of things, I think that's where you find some hope. And let's encourage all of our elected officials up here in Northern California, to really explore this and to really do the right thing.
Please, can I say who you are?
Hi, thank you so much. I'm Jennifer. I'm an exchange student from Germany and an aspiring social entrepreneur. So complying with CSR regulations at home is one thing, but then doing other stuff abroad is actually, a different story, because I was just recently attending a panel on workers' rights, and Germany is very famous for respecting, workers' rights, but then turns out that they come to the southern states in the US to kind of exploit the situation of lack of workers' protection. And also because you mentioned Heineken, there was this huge scandal that came out this year of stuff Heineken does in Africa. So I'm just curious, what international regulations do you envision to, prevent problems like that? Companies complying with CSR at home, but then doing, different things
I don't
abroad.
think there are any international regulations are likely to occur. I think that has to be voluntary. And I do think a lot of the corporate responsibility initiatives have focused on their conduct among their suppliers and producers in poorer countries and developing countries. That's been a big frontier. That was a big issue with Nike 20 years ago in terms of treatment of workers. So I think that really requires relentless public and consumer pressure to put the spotlight on these firms and get them to behave better. I think some have behaved better, but I think on the whole sweatshop phenomena is pretty discouraging. And I think it's largely when it comes to clothing, which is probably the main manufacturing item in developing countries. People want inexpensive clothing, and they want fashions to change rapidly. And so the lack of consumer pressure on these firms is discouraging. Mm-hmm. But I think public and media pressure have played a positive role. I mean, Nike is, people who work for Nike suppliers they're not in great shape, but they're in better shape than they were in 1990.
Yeah, and another good example is Levi Strauss. And I know that when Bob Haas retired, he told me that one of the things that he was most proud of was the strict standards that they had put into place eventually in Asia, in plants where they contracted to have the jeans stitched and sewn. And they were embarrassed. That's how they got to it. I mean, they didn't initially just go in and say, let's try to treat these people as well as we treated our employees in the U.S. That wasn't where they started, but they ended up there. And Bob, in the book, I describe the process that he had to go through to get from where they were, which was having some real sweatshops, some really terrible places, to now having all their companies sourced from quite responsible businesses. And also the apparel industry in the United States got together and set standards, which was a very positive thing as well, as has the toy industry in America, which also uses a lot of relatively unskilled labor in Asia that was exploited quite badly. And they were not as far along in the toy industry as the apparel industry.
We have time for one very quick question, if we could, please.
Hi, I'm Rupa. I am a social entrepreneur. We design climate insurance products for emerging economy governments. My question is about the bad news in the sector. Is it really something that we have created in some sense by trying to measure impact of CSR on society? Rather than trying to ask that question, could we better pitch ourselves if we just said that this is really good for long-term business and competitive advantage? So is it a storytelling problem, is my question. I really think that businesses which think of themselves and a slightly long-term view seem to succeed. We maybe are not pitching ourselves well that way.
I mean, I think speaking for your book, I mean, I think your book suggests that isn't always the case, that in the short run, these things often work together, social impact and financial performance. But in the long run, what seems to happen is that the social dimensions become more marginalized and the financial performance becomes more focused. So I think that's the broad story, I think, of the stories in your book is basically about, in the long run, in the short run you can pull it off. In the long run, it's hard to remain both profitable and responsible. Is that fair?
Yeah, and particularly if it's a publicly traded company. I look at, there are several social entrepreneurial organizations I look at in the book, are started off as socially entrepreneurial. Anita Roddick's The Body Shop, Tom Chappell's Tom's of Maine, and a couple of others. But just with both of those, Ben
and Jerry's.
And Ben and Jerry's is probably the third. For a while, they were able really to do the right things, but then things started to happen at the end. The founders were getting older, and the question is, what happens after they left? How could they keep this going? And they ended up in all three companies selling the companies to large companies that gave the assurance that they would keep up those practices. In none of the three companies did they do so. All right, and I don't know if that really answers your question, but what the struggle that Tom's of Maine went through is one that I think all social entrepreneurs are going to face. He documented it in great detail, the struggle that went on in his own soul between getting really rich and continuing to do the right thing. Right? And he struggled with it for years. And he lays this all out in agonizing detail. He bares his soul, telling about people, I wake up in the middle of the night, do I want to be rich or do I want to be good? And he's going on and on and on and on. And in the very end, he decided to get rich.
This brings to a close wasn't expecting that, Jim. This brings to a close a very special Deans and Peterson Speakers series. The book is Enlightened Capitalism. Please join me in thanking Professor David Vogel, Professor James O'Toole.
Thank you all. Thank you. Just one thing. You've got a great resource in this guy, and you should come see him about a lot of these questions. He's thought a lot about it. And go,
Get the mic.
Yeah, go see him. All right.